Hello, everyone. Welcome to this interview of the Lotus Eaters. I'm very pleased to be interviewing Johan Norberg. Thank you very much for being with us. And Johan
Thanks for having
Norberg
me.
is an historian, an author, and a commentator, also senior fellow of the Cato Institute, and author of books like Peak Human, What We Can Learn from the Rise and Fall of Golden Ages. And also you have written a book called The Capitalist Manifesto, and many more books. And the Capitalist Manifesto is called Why the Global Free Market Will Save the World. And as I was saying before, I follow your work for a long time, especially after I watched the documentary you did about Adam Smith. So thank you very much for this, and I'm very pleased to be interviewing you today.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Right, so the first thing that I'm very happy about is that this book is very optimistic. Peak Human, everyone can watch it here. And we live in a world that has pessimistic tendencies. And especially on social media and the news, there seems to be too much negativity and too little stress on positivity. So it's good to have some optimistic books once in a while. And I wanted to start by asking you a personal question. So what made you want to be an intellectual and an author?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it depends on how deep you go. It could be just the love of books and of literature and of history and wanting to live in that world. But obviously, you need some kind of message as well. I guess that's one reason why I always wanted to write, do research, learn more, and talk about what I've learned in various ways. And I think that's partly because I learned something important when I was young, and that was that my worldview was all wrong. And my worldview back then, which was very pessimistic, quite anti-capitalist, very much opposed to the modern world generally, and then realizing how much my life, the fact that I managed to grow up in a country free from poverty, hunger, and despair, was very much thanks to the Industrial Revolution, thanks to trade, to business, to technology. And well, if I could be wrong about that, lots of others could be wrong about that as well. And I wanted to tell that story. So in some way, that's one of my motivations.
When you were more pessimistic, did you feel a sentiment of complete hopelessness of the modern world? I think you mentioned the modern world when you described your previous situation. Would you say that before you thought that everything was doomed to an inevitable decline? And if so, how did this change?
Yes, no, I think that's a good description of where I was. I thought that the modern world was sort of ugly, hopeless, unjust in various ways, and then you start to think that if you don't fit in, and I mean, when you're young, you rarely think you fit in anywhere, right? But you assume that there must have been some past when we lived more in harmony with one another and with nature, and only going back there would make sense. What helped me to get out of that perspective was studying history and realizing that there were no good old days back then. Life was nasty, brutish, and short. And my ancestors in northern Sweden, they usually starved when the weather was bad. So understanding that they didn't live ecologically, they died ecologically at a very young age, that got me away from that mentality.
I suspect that empirical data was paramount in your changing of perspective, because a lot of the time people think very metaphysically, and they tend to subscribe to some views of history according to which, like some understandings of Plato, history is just a rapid decline and nothing can halt it, basically. And essentially reading history, but also focusing on empirical data helps. And I think that you have been doing this throughout your work, because especially, for instance, when you're talking about capitalism, you are mentioning data against lots of leftists and lots of people who are too much prone towards statism.
Yes, that's right. And, I don't think that every person who is supposed to uh, free markets and to open liberal democracies are driven by data to end up there. It might be that they have completely different values and attitudes to what's good in life. But I think I have a very hard time convincing them. But there are lots of people who reject uh, free market capitalism because they think that it's bad, that the outcomes are bad, that it hurts the poor, that it hurts the middle classes. And then they're just wrong on a factual basis. And I think it is easier to come up with an empirical case that might actually convince them.
Yes. Okay. So I agree with this, and I have met people of the sort. Right. So I wanted to ask you about your northern Sweden and Scandinavia, because I constantly see people, especially from the social democrat left, who present Scandinavia as a sort of social democrat paradise. And I hear also people from who are not leftists who say the exact opposite. Now, where would you fall there, and what do you think about this idea that Scandinavia has been a social democrat paradise?
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and what I'm trying to tell people about my own country is that Sweden has been socialist, and it has been a great, thriving, rich society, but never simultaneously, never at the same time. So, I mean, the background when we really grew much faster than the rest of the world and created one of the richest civilizations that has ever existed. That was a 100-year period from roughly 1870 to 1970. And that was when Sweden had a very limited government, a very open economy, very free market oriented. As late as the 1960s, we had lower taxes than other European countries, lower taxes than the United States. And that made us incredibly rich. But then, for a brief moment in time, then Swedish politicians thought, we have all this wealth. Why not spend it? Why not redistribute it and increase public consumption? And they doubled the size of government. They regulated most things in Sweden. And that's when we got a 25-year period of quite socialist policies in Sweden. But that was not our golden age. That was more like our Atlas Shrugged era when the great innovators, the businesses like IKEA, they left Sweden for other places because they couldn't do business back there. Since then, it ended in a terrible financial crisis in the early 1990s. Since then, Sweden has reformed again and liberalized its economy. So once again, I would say that it's more free market than most European countries, and it's also outperforming most of them again. So, but this time around, it's a little bit more mixed than it was before. But it's quite easy to see that when we had the most big governments, we did the biggest mistakes.
Okay, so in a textbook fashion, lots of statists come in the 70s, they get the credit, and they try to create a propaganda whose narrative says that they get the credit for the wealth that the free market produced, or the freer market produced, and they completely destroyed everything afterwards. Or, okay, that was a bit hyperbolic, but essentially that was it.
Yeah, and I mean, if you have already created a thriving society, a very wealthy country with big businesses ranking in the export revenue, it's easy to make mistakes for a while without everything falling apart. But we were quickly losing economic growth compared to others. We didn't create a single net job in the private sector for more than 30 years. We didn't create the new employment opportunities or businesses or technologies. So it was a slow but steady decline during those years. However, compared to other countries, it might have seemed that, yeah, we were still one of the richest countries in the world. Only relatively we were losing out. But it's like that old joke: how do you end up with a small fortune? Well, you start with a large fortune, and then you waste some of it.
I remember watching the historian Neil Ferguson telling to people from Scandinavia that there have been issues with Scandinavian multiculturalist policies, and that in some cases there has been lack of integration of some migrant communities. Would you say that this is a fair criticism?
I think it is. I think some of it might be exaggerated because from a distance, everything seems hopeless. I think overall, integration has worked fairly well in Sweden, but we have also had a very large refugee immigration in recent years from places, and this is from Syria to Afghanistan to African countries, where where we've had very low levels of education, sometimes low levels of literacy as well, harder time to integrate, especially in a country where everything has been fairly homogenous so far in many of our systems. So, for example, in a weird paradox, we have more people who've arrived recently without any kind of advanced education, but we also have, as a share of the workforce, fewer simple jobs that don't require any advanced education than any other European Union country. And obviously, if you then combine that with relatively generous welfare policies, it means that you'll see large scale unemployment, exclusion, many people not ending up in work where they learn the skills, the connections, the language, but instead end up in relatively isolated enclaves. That creates all manners of problems with integration, with crime, and so on.
Absolutely, yes. Right, so I think it's a good idea if we go to your latest book, Peak Human. And I want to ask you, what do you think is a golden age? How best should we understand the golden age? And how does discourse about golden ages differ from mythologizing golden ages?
That's an incredibly important question because they're not really the same. To me, a golden age is an episode of a creative explosion where we see a large number of innovations taking place in different spheres, different sections of life. So it's associated with cultural creativity, technological innovation, scientific discovery, and economic growth. So it's an era with rapidly emergent novelty. That's not the same as the mythology of a particular era and the way in which people lived back then, because that's usually more of the museum version of a golden age, where you think about how they dressed, the kind of art that they produced. It could become quite sterile. And oftentimes when want to go back there, we just imitate sort of going through the motions rather than going to that sense of exploration and innovation that really made them powerful. So what I would say is that a golden age is something where we don't really envy the particular way in which they lived, because obviously compared to us, all past ages have been sort of very poor and less free. It's not how they lived or how they dressed, but it's the way they look to the future. That's what I envy, the way in which they thought that they could accomplish things, they could create a better life for them and for their societies.
Right. So I remember Hesiod in Works and Days is talking about the myth of the Golden Ages. And he says that the land was freely giving goods to people. Essentially, you say that there was lack of economic scarcity. But in your book, I think you mean something a bit different. You are talking about also about how people dealt with economic scarcity with an open mind as well, which led to creativity and in some cases, lots of unpredictable successes, like with the Dutch Republic. And right, okay, so when it comes to golden ages, do you think that there is a tendency of people in right now to look at the past and try to romanticize it? And if you think that this is sometimes wrong, what's the difference between talking about golden ages in the past and romanticizing the past?
Yeah, great question. Yes, I think we are in such a situation right now. There's lots of nostalgia, and I can understand that and sympathize with that. When the world seems dangerous, obviously we want to assume that there was some sort of past when we didn't face problems like this. That's not what I take away from history when I study the history books and my ancestors. They faced horrible problems and disasters constantly. But what made them get through it was often this sort of focusing minds on how they could innovate around problems and moving on. And that's what I envy when it comes to golden ages. It's not the same thing as romanticizing the past, romanticizing these ages, because that's the way of where we think that that's where we would have wanted to live. I don't think we do. Mary Beard, the classicist, she points out that when people say they would have wanted to live in the Roman Empire, they usually assume that they would have been emperors or senators, which is a few hundred people, rather than one of the poor farmers or millions of slaves in various places. So it's not that lifestyle, but the way in which they, in these eras, managed to constantly be creative and come up with new ways of tackling problems. That's what make them really unique, and that's what we should imitate, not the particular way that they lived. One particular example is, the Ming dynasty in China in the 14th and 15th century and onwards. They were romantics and nostalgics. They thought that there must have been a golden age in the past. So they tried to retreat to that, and burning the boats and the maps because we don't need foreign trade and foreign ideas and new technologies, and even forced people to dress the way they did 500 years earlier, because that was the way to romanticize what was going on there. That didn't create a golden age, that created 500 years of stagnation, because it turned off the taps of new ideas, innovations, business models.
Sounds ill-advised. Right, so what do you think are the main causes of a golden age? So if we don't have a golden age right now, or if a society isn't in a particularly golden state, let's say, in its trajectory, how do we bring a golden age about?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's often quite surprising. You rarely plan a golden age, and then it happens. It happens because you suddenly have this surge of energy in a certain place, a certain area. Oftentimes, the two basic ingredients are imitation and innovation. You need some ideas to innovate, to imitate, to learn from. Often they appear in the crossroads between different civilizations. Often they're maritime cultures, trading constantly with the outside world and meeting merchants, migrants, missionaries who come up with new ideas, new texts, new methods. Then you have to do something with those ingredients. You need to have an innovative situation back home. And one key input then is some sort of freedom for surprises, openness to surprises back home. Allow farmers to experiment with new crops or irrigation systems, or with new ways of building businesses or lending systems without trying to plan everything according to a blueprint. If you do that in the right way, what emerges, and that's really a key part, is a culture of possibility, some sort of culture of optimism, where people begin to think that it's worth testing new ideas, it's worth experimenting, it's worth investing in the future, because it might work out and I might even get a huge monetary reward when I do that. You need that sense of hope, the belief that it's worth exerting effort to create a better future. Otherwise, you won't.
Right. So how do you think golden ages end? What should we, if I'm during a golden age, if I'm living during a golden age, what should I guard against? What should I be vigilant against? So what do I not want to see that may signal the end of the golden age I'm living in?
Yeah, the first thing that I would be worried about is this intolerance to surprises. All of these golden ages that I've looked at, when they begin to decline and eventually fall, they have some sort of death to Socrates moment. Some moment when they sour on their tradition of intellectual openness and innovation and start to execute their great philosophers. And hopefully we don't go that far that we start to poison them or execute them, but it could happen in other ways. A lack of an open debate, trying to implement an orthodoxy at universities or in the online media. That's a worrying sign. Any kind of shutdown of not just the intellectual openness, but also economic openness, dismantling or blocking, regulating too much, stopping new business models, or abandoning trade, abandoning the idea that we can get great goods, services, technologies, and ideas from the outside world is usually a sign that we're in a bad place.
I suspect that you're not a fan of the sort of leftist ideology that to a large extent has infiltrated universities and creates all sorts of problems about the flow of ideas.
No, that's right. When you start to think that this is a place where we only think in one particular way and everything else is disturbing or immoral, and you start to shout down speakers and teachers if they provoke you in any way, that's the traditional sign that you're in a bad place and you're not really open to this this back and forth with people who do not share your ideas. They are your most important teachers, even if they might be wrong. They've seen the world from another perspective, and that helps you to learn something that you didn't know before. So it's so that's a bad sign. And the way to contrast a lack of speech is more speech and freer speech, rather than trying to implement some sort of right-wing orthodoxy and punish everybody who thinks differently. So that's one thing that I'm worried about with the present US administration. Doesn't make it right.
Right. So I want to ask you something about psychology. It seems to me that the kind of psychology you describe, or the psychology that ends the golden age, is a psychology according to which life is much more painful than good. So we need to take all sorts of blocks towards the potential goods in order to avoid potential pains. So it creates a sort of, would you say that there is a kind of pessimism towards life itself and the mentality and psychology that ends a golden age or characterizes the ages of stagnation?
Yes, definitely. I mean, why do we bother? Why do we go out of bed in the morning or leave the cave and go out there? It's because we have some sort of sense that, first of all, there must be something exciting out there. There must be something to learn from, or something useful, or new partners, new ideas. You also need some sort of sense in your own agency that you can accomplish things, that you're responsible for the outcome, so that it's worth going out there, and that's incredibly useful. And when people are inspired to do that big term, that's really something that helps us to create golden ages. But once we lose that hope, once we lose that conviction, that's when we start to go downhill, and ways for different reasons. But one of them is that it might be dangerous out there. When you go out there, when you try something new, you might fail. It might be people out there who don't want to help you out. They might even be dangerous to you. So in times of trouble, you want to retreat to your cave. You give up. You don't want to experiment with things long term, because who knows if there's any point in doing that. This is one of the great signs right now of cultural decline, I think. This lack of hope, this lack of believing in individual agency and in individual agency, and that's very dangerous.
I want to add something now that's completely spontaneous, because agency and free agency was part of my PhD. I really think that there is a lot of anti-meritocratic sentiments in the philosophy of the last 50 or 60 years. And this goes throughout the political spectrum. And I think perhaps it is John Rawls who has been perhaps the most vocal opponent of the notion of desert, because he says, I think, in the Theory of Justice and then the sequels he made of that work, that essentially that the notion of desert makes no sense because it's based on free will, and free will makes no sense. So at the end of the day, what we do individually doesn't matter as far as what we deserve. So we shouldn't think about what we deserve. And I think that's a disastrous notion. And it also focuses so much on prioritizing just outcomes instead of what leads to these outcomes. Because a lot of people focus on power, but power isn't always exercised. So I don't care if people have the same power of the same capacities. I think society needs to prioritize and also promote people who exercise their powers. But for people like Rawls, that doesn't matter. This doesn't matter because they constantly find reasons why, for instance, someone's agency was undermined, because they start with a sort of egalitarian idea that fundamentally all human beings would do the same thing. And if they act differently, it's something that is not up to them that is the issue. Would you say that you see this sort of attack on the notion of free agency in political philosophy, but also in ethical philosophy of the last decades?
Oh, I do, for sure. And I'm glad you raised this, because this is a very dangerous sign for any society, I think. I think this is partly because of intellectuals who have told us, who have sort of really dissected human psychology and our biological existence to sell us the story that nothing is in our hands, in our grasp, and everything is outside influence, whether it be genes or the environment, no free will. But then there's a popular version of it, which is very easy to sell for politicians, and often populists from the left to the right, telling everyone that, look, your problems is never your fault. You have no responsibility, you have no agency. If something is bad, it's because somebody did this to you. And we will help you then get to what you want, what you need, what you deserve. And that both those perspectives are selling us despair. They're selling us hopelessness, that no matter what I do, it doesn't matter. And in that case, why bother? You're going to have to wait for a savior instead, often big government coming in to help you. And obviously then that will undermine that cultural sense of achievement and of optimism that we need. And I would go so far as to say that we need to believe in agency, we need to believe in meritocracy, and that's we need to believe that we are responsible for the outcomes in our life, even in an exaggerated way. Because obviously, we all know this from everything from introspection to studying society and history, that no, we're not responsible for every single outcome. There are such things as a bad starting point or bad luck, obviously. But the problem is, if we exaggerate that, people will always give up and end up in a worse place. And there's such strong evidence that people will do better. They will face better outcomes if they believe that they're responsible for the outcomes, even if they believe it in an exaggerated way. So whatever we do, let's not sell them an exaggerated story that everything's hopeless.
Would you say that this is also part of the philosophy of welfarism, which I understand is a very abstract and general point, but would you say that there are trends of welfarist approaches to social phenomena and ethics that create, that lead to the creation of a culture of dependency and people thinking that, well, I deserve to get this or that good and access to this or that good, irrespective of what I do, because it doesn't matter what I do and it doesn't matter what the other person does? Would you say that there is a strong tendency of welfarist thinking in that respect?
I would definitely say that that's where it ended up. It didn't always start that way. I think often those who try to build some sort of social welfare systems, they still often believed in individual responsibility and achievement, but thought that they could introduce some sort of safety net in times of trouble in your own life, or whether there are external reasons for you failing temporarily, whether it be from bad health or what have you. The problem is when you start going down that road, it's easy to expand on that because there's no limit to what people want in terms of material benefits and safety and security. It's never enough. And then there will always be a temptation to build on these systems and to even encourage a certain degree of welfarism, selling people the idea that they are not responsible for the outcomes of their lives, and therefore they need more and more of government involvement on both the tax side and the benefit side. And that's dangerous because it rarely ends before we end up in some sort of financial misery.
It also raises people and habituates them to think that they can get goods for nothing and they don't have to practice virtues of industriousness themselves. Right, so I want us to go to the Greco Roman antiquity because you start your book with ancient Athens and ancient Rome in the first two chapters, unless I'm mistaken. So what would you say are the main cultural achievements of Greco-Roman antiquity that are worthy of trying to retain or at least recapture in their spirit?
Well, it's difficult to limit it because they are responsible for so much, from language to philosophy to religion to our very words and our concepts of law. The fact that in America senators meet on the Capitol in a republic, or we live in democracies. We got all of those ideas from the Greeks and the Romans. We got the ideas that we should in some way limit the arbitrary powers of government and give it to either the whole free male population at least, or to some sort of republican system where it's held in common by the people, even if it's not a democracy as such. And those are all important achievements. But if I had to mention one, I would say the whole idea, the very idea of intellectual innovation. Because in previous societies, there had been in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, there had been ideas, or novel ideas, obviously, but people always try to sell them by saying that, oh, I dug this up from my ancestors, or this was handed to us from some sort of ancient god. For the first time in the Greek world, specifically in Athens, it was seen as something that was important and worthwhile, and even acquired you with status if you came up with original ideas. If you managed to show, if Aristotle managed to show that Plato was mistaken, that was actually something good. He didn't have to pretend that this is really what Plato meant. And I think that all of our intellectual achievements since then are dependent on that basic insight.
There is a healthy emphasis on questions, I think, in ancient thought, especially in ancient Greece, which I don't find in other cultures, at least to that level. And by that I mean cultures of the time, because there was very sophisticated thinking, especially mythological thinking, in many other cultures like ancient India, ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia. But I think that there does seem to be a deviation from this, especially with Socrates and the sophists, as far as discourse and questioning was concerned. And I think that this did play a part in this innovative spirit that you mentioned. But I think there's also a tragedy, because I remember in Thucydides, apologies, who said that the Athenians had a very extroverted and creative spirit, which led them into several adventures, whereas the Spartans were a bit more stagnant. They had a very stagnant soul along the lines we discussed a few minutes ago. But it seems that the Spartans won the war. So when you say that in some cases there's sort of tragedy there.
Yeah, no, I agree with most of the things you said there, that healthy inquiry and constantly challenging things, something like that. Monty Python explained this perfectly in the Life of Brian movie, where, Brian is trying to come up with a story. There were two brothers, and the challenging Athenian, basically in his mentality, goes, "What were their names?" "What? I don't know." "We need to know their names. You don't know these characters you're talking about?" "Okay, they were called Simon and Adrian." "Oh, but you said you didn't know." He's making it up as he goes along. That kind of challenging perspective, I think, is what helps us to get then to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and onwards. And then the question is it always useful? Sometimes we have to gather forces and sort of unquestioningly, without questions, just march towards a threat, which happens during the Peloponnesian War, for example. And then obviously there are instances. It was a long, brutal war. I would call it at the end some sort of stalemate, even though the Spartans won that first round. There are instances where authoritarian governments might keep up that sort of will and constantly push people onwards towards certain death in some instances, whereas it might be more difficult in other places. And that, we see parallels to that today with Russia being able to constantly push more people into the meat grinder, and that's something that more open, innovative societies have to think about. We have to make up for that by being more innovating, coming up with new technologies, and using our resources to really build stronger defenses through ingenuity, then, rather than just authoritarian discipline.
It seems to me that just by focusing on openness, we aren't also focusing on the sort of decisions we're making, because it seems to me that the Athenians were way more open than the Spartans. But we could say that to a degree, the Sicilian expedition was at least half of the death of the ancient Athenian democracy. So would you say that in some cases there can be tendencies within very open societies that lead to a sort of stretch, or a sort of, or lead them to exceed particular limits, which raises the necessity for being a bit more responsible?
No, that's a great question. And in that quote by Thucydides you mentioned, it sounds great with the Athenian constantly exploring to find new opportunities, whereas the Spartan stays at home to protect what he's already got. But obviously you can go too far in your exploration. There is such a thing as too much adventurism in various places. And yes, the Athenians show that again and again. I'd say some of the involvement in Persia perhaps was a bit too radical, and so was definitely the Sicilian expedition. Too excited and going out too far to try to rearrange the world and make lots of money, of course. And that happens today in democracies as well. I think we have just experienced in the early 2000s the American attempt to constantly rearrange the whole of the Middle East, which turned out in an utter failure. And we'll see what happens this time around. We don't know yet, but it's true. You can arouse those sensations, the idea that our ideas, our systems are so great. Let's go out and try to do everything. That's very hubristic, and it might end up in terrible failures. So yes, we sometimes need to retreat. We sometimes need that cautious part of our human nature as well. Even though I would say in this day and age, in Europe at least, it's not that there's not too much adventure and excitement going on. Perhaps we've made the opposite mistake. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, there's zero disagreement from me there. Right. Speaking of the Middle East, but the geography of the region, what do you think that made the Abbasid Caliphate have this golden age? What ushered in the golden age of the Abbasid Caliphate, and how was it tragically lost?
Yeah, no, that is a fascinating story. And one reason why I wrote so much about it is that I think it's a good counterexample to the idea that it's hopeless to create any kind of open societies and dynamic economies in certain regions with certain cultures. This was a Muslim empire governed by Arabs, even though it was then combined with Persians, with Jews, with Zoroastrians, with and different peoples and languages and so on. Um, and they were great when they were open to those other ideas, when they invited not just merchants, it was a free trade empire, but also scientists and philosophers from other places, translating their works, learning from their science and from their discoveries, from their data. And then you don't have to go further than the letter A to realize how much we're indebted to that Arab civilization. You know, arithmetic, algebra, algorithm, Arabic numerals, average, words like that showing how they thrived when it came to science and technology. And Baghdad in the 9th century, at a time when Paris and London had some 20,000 people, they had more than 1.5 million inhabitants, perhaps as many as 1 million, according to certain sources. So it was really a golden age, a very, very wealthy society. It began to break down when they had their death to Socrates moment, when they began, the empire started to fracture in different parts, different interpretations of the Muslim faith, which meant that the Abbasids who governed, they became fearful. They thought that they had to impose one orthodoxy onto everybody. So instead of having free speech and freedom of religion, they instituted state-run religious schools where the scholars could get something they didn't have before. They were funded by the government. They had sort of a stable employment. But of course, the other side of the coin was, in that case, they had to repeat the orthodoxy rather than constantly challenging it and discovering something new. So that was a slow but steady decline, which was then also it turned into a more vicious decline as civil war and eventually a Mongol invasion ruined it all. But much of that energy, much of that knowledge, the state of science had already been lost. And that was lost because of their own internal decisions, not by external forces.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Song China now. Again, what do you think is really important about Song China and its golden age?
Yeah, no, I find it so fascinating that oftentimes we talk about China as this ancient culture, which it is, obviously, and they had all those things: gunpowder, the magnetic compass, paper, and the printing press a long, long time before we did. You know, Karl Marx said that the three inventions that ushered in the role of the bourgeoisie in Europe during the Industrial Revolution were those things. But obviously, they were of ancient history, and they came from China specifically during the Song dynasty. That's where they had the most innovation, the most rapid development going on. And this is because it was also the era in which they were most open to surprises. They had more of rule of law than they had under other Chinese dynasties, so that it was possible for scholars and for merchants and for farmers to come up with new ideas, for urban artisans to experiment. And then they really did. They learned about how to grow new varieties of rice and of tea, and how to do that in a large scale, so that what was previously luxuries for the rich became sort of staples for the average Chinese. the population grew dramatically. And then that was combined with an urban revolution when you don't need as many hands in agriculture. They could go to the cities. And in cities, they have a more advanced specialization. So people come up with all sorts of different trades and technologies. And I would argue they were close in China during the Song dynasty of really ushering in an industrial revolution. They probably produced more iron than all of Europe did in the late 17th century. And they had textile machines which could have continued to show the way to a real industrial revolution. It was an impressive era.
So I think you mentioned two words that don't go well together. It's Marx and agriculture. And the next question I have is, how could the Chinese with such a history end up with Mao's Great Famine? What was it about? Okay, both of us, I don't think we're a fan of communism. But what was it about Mao's China that was completely deaf to the past as far as this was concerned?
Yeah, that is scary. And it tells you again that don't take anything for granted, because you can end up, you can have a creative explosion, but you can also lose it all if you have the wrong people in charge specifically. Yes, Mao managed to win power through force, and he was like the anti-Song of China's history. Rather than believing in the individual farmers and their families, their local communities, how they constantly came up with new ideas and better ideas that were often surprising to others, he thought that he knew best. He thought that he knew exactly which crops to grow and how to create a local industrial revolution from the top down by having your local iron production and things like that. Crazy ideas, but crazy ideas are fine if they are limited, if they are run by individuals and businesses who are also allowed to fail. Because then you learn from those lessons, you learn from those mistakes. But when one crazy person like that is in charge of the entire country, you all make the same kind of mistake at the same time, and you end up with the greatest famine in world history. It's a huge, huge tragedy and should be a lesson to all of us.
I think that this is the distinction between a sort of spontaneous order, as Friedrich Hayek was talking about, echoing the tradition of Human Smith, and planned chaos on the other, because there does seem to be a sort of conceit when it comes to planners, and they think that they can know enough to redesign society. But it seems to me that golden ages come when we do the exact opposite, when we sort of trust humanity a bit more, and we are a bit more decentralized in our societies, and we grant liberties to more people as opposed to opt for authoritarianism and closed minds. So closed minds, I think almost everyone will agree that closed minds are generally speaking a problem, but I'm trying to understand where exactly are the limits of tolerance and where exactly are the limits of innovation, because it seems to me that there can be some avenues that are not particularly worthy of exploring. So for instance, innovation could stand for all sorts of things. It could stand for things that violate lots of ethical precepts that we have, such as running experiments on live humans. So where do you think how do we discipline our... I agree with you, essentially. I want decentralization. I want a sort of sensible individualism and sensible liberalism. But how do we achieve a sort of discipline that doesn't lead us astray? I understand that this is a very general question, but I think it's a question that is really interesting.
Yeah, it is really interesting, and it creates this there are paradoxes, both when it comes to tolerance and when it comes to innovation. Are you tolerant against the intolerant, those who would undermine and ruin your entire societies? It depends. Yes, some errors have to be accepted, but obviously we cannot accept anyone to tear down the openness, the liberal democracies that we have created. There is a paradox when it comes to innovation as well, because obviously if acquiring new capacity is great, but the ways in which we acquire that capacity can always be questioned. And also some of the results can be used to undermine that very process. And we obviously face some challenges when it comes to everything from AI to weapons of mass destruction today. So there are limits out there. To me, it's quite difficult to see where you sit in a committee and then trying to foresee the future and declare exactly where the boundaries are being drawn. I think we need some sort of sensitivity to the changes that are going on, learning from them, learning from the experiments and the innovation that goes on, and then trying to move the not particularly the goalpost, but the boundaries of what's acceptable and what's not. And for sure, you mentioned experiments on live human beings. That's something that we wouldn't want to accept. And where do we draw those lines? I think that's exactly what open societies need, a good, healthy, open conversation about, and possibly come up with some clear distinctions.
Do you think that there are several sides that try to influence open society and try to run propagandistic campaigns in order to circulate ideas that could contaminate most people's understanding of what is acceptable or not?
Oh, for sure. We know that many want to influence us both domestically and externally. There are huge projects by Russia and China trying to influence the way we think in open societies as well. And obviously more or less organized versions of that back home. Well, we are trying to influence opinion, right? But people can do that in clandestine and more secretive ways as well. What's important to me is that we always that we have as much transparency as possible, that we know who's doing what, and the paradox of tolerance is there again. If there are closed societies trying to undermine our societies in systematic ways, we need a strategy against that in order to combat that kind of attempt to undermine what is going on. However, what both you and I are engaged in, and people on the other sides, that's the healthy version of it, because that is the collision between different ideas. And hopefully, from the light of those collisions, we hopefully can see things in a stronger light and hopefully learn something new and better.
Right. So one thing that I'm struggling with is that it seems to me that there have been some ages that have produced remarkable achievements that weren't exactly decentralized and liberalized. So for instance, some people give the example of the early Roman Empire, particularly during Augustus. They said that there was a kind of stability that ended the clashes and civil wars of the Romans. And that kind of stability was very much good for trade, but also it led to lots of historians writing, lots of good architecture. And then there are also some people who say that in the medieval era, for instance, there was authoritarian governance and minds weren't as open as they were during the Renaissance or before the Middle Ages, at least in some places. But there still were several very important cultural achievements that some people do seem to identify as them being golden ages. So what do you think about that? Do you think that's fair?
First of all, agree to a certain extent that we don't want too much decentralization, because the useful decentralization, the one in which people can, in a very Hayekian way, come up with new knowledge, technology, and business, and art and culture from their own vantage points. That's dependent on a certain political centralization rather than decentralization, because you need a strong and enforceable rule of law that creates the predictable institutions that makes it possible for society to be a little bit unpredictable. Otherwise, you end up in the sort of the chaos in which you have no idea which rules are there tomorrow. And in that case, why bother? Why invest in the future if you don't have, say, enforceable property rights or secure trade routes and things like that? And I agree, with the late Roman Republic, it was an era of, even before the civil wars, where you had too many strong consuls who wanted to impress too much in the 1 year in power. So they start wars all over the place. You have local governors who just want to tax people as brutally and arbitrarily as possible in their short term in power. In that case, Augustus, for all his faults, he was the guy who set down clear rules that were enforced throughout the empire, and made sure that the pirates and the plunderers did not attack the travelers in the Alps or on the Mediterranean. And yes, you needed that in order to create this flourishing as well. So there is oftentimes unpredictability and surprises in civil society and in the economy is often dependent on a lack of surprises when it comes to violence and force and politics.
One of my favorite chapters from your book was the chapter about the Dutch Republic. I must say, I really enjoyed it because I wasn't that knowledgeable of that era. And in that respect, I thought it was one of the most novel. At least you were introducing me to a completely new topic in some respects. And I think you say at some point in the book that the example of the Dutch Republic falsifies Marxist interpretations of capitalism, according to which capitalism necessarily arises from forcing lots of people to become proletarian workers. What do you have to say about this a bit more? I think the audience would really love to hear about this. What was it that Marx got absolutely wrong about capitalism, and how do the Dutch falsify him?
I'm glad you mentioned that chapter, because it's really a favorite of mine as well, because it seems so unlikely. This weird northwestern periphery of Europe that didn't have much. They didn't even have land on which to stand and grow their food. They're up against the mightiest empire on the planet, the Habsburg Spanish Empire. And after an 8-year war, this is a bit of a spoiler, but they win their independence, but they also create the richest civilization on the planet. And it's also interesting, as you point out, because it completely contradicts Karl Marx's idea, this origin story of capitalism. He thinks that capitalism is created through forcibly evicting peasants from the land, from the common agricultural land. We have some sort of original communism and everything was great, but then suddenly they're thrown off this privatized enclosed land, and now they have to sell the only thing they have left, their labor, on the market. And then the capitalists and the owners of the means of production, they benefit. But whatever we think of later examples of capitalism, and we could challenge Marx there as well. The interesting thing is that the first real modern capitalist economy, and I would argue that this is the Dutch economy even as early as the 14th century, but definitely then the 16th and 17th century, was not created by any kind of forcing people away from their land. It was a very because there wasn't much land there to begin with, and few aristocrats. Instead, they were farmers and fishermen who got often the right to the land by moving there, by keeping it free from water, from the oceans. And they began to establish commercial transactions voluntarily with others in the local economy, but also through trade links, especially with the Baltic area, because they knew that they would benefit from more food from there. They didn't have enough land on which to grow their grain, and then started to specialize themselves in the things that they could produce, everything from fish to textiles, later on financial services, and so on. So it's really more of a sort of almost a utopian, John Lockean version of how you establish a capitalist economy. You're sort of sitting down trying to solve your problems. We don't have much here. How can we establish peaceful commercial transactions with others? And in this way, they commercialized the whole countryside and also build a very urban society. And this is one reason why Karl Marx didn't like to talk about the Netherlands and the Dutch Republic, because it completely contradicts it, even though I think his mother was from this place originally, or her family, because it completely contradicts his theory.
What was it about the Spaniards at the time, during the 80 Years' War, that led them to declare bankruptcy 5 times? They're supposed to be the mightiest empire. Silver and gold is flowing. They have they control most of Europe, not most of Europe, but a very significant part of Europe. What was it that led them to declare bankruptcy 5 times? And in opposition to that, the Dutch, who were, as you said, outnumbered, and they lacked resources, at least to the extent that the Spaniards possessed. And actually, they ended that war by being, as you said, a great superpower and richer than before.
Yeah.
What happened there?
I think this is, now we've just talked about how the Dutch Republic contradicts Karl Marx's theories of capitalism. It also contradicts and disproves the very popular idea that wealth comes from having lots of resources to begin with. You have your rich agricultural land and plenty of natural resources, and you have valuable metals like silver and gold. The Spanish, they had all that. And they had a huge army, and they had their huge navy. And the Dutch, they didn't have much except their innovative capitalist spirit. And I think that helped the Dutch because it forced them to become innovative. They knew that it was impossible to sustain their country without constantly coming up with new technologies, better business models, better financial systems. Whereas the Spaniards, and especially the Habsburg rulers, they thought that we have all these resources. Let's just use them to acquire more resources and then hire the armies to invade the Netherlands and try to take that away from them. The problem then is they don't regenerate resources. They don't have a system, a commercial system that makes it possible for them to acquire more resources. So they declare state bankruptcy, and then they just try to steal more silver and hire more armies and go to war again. And they had to declare state bankruptcy again. Whereas the Dutch constantly during this time build new wealth. They amass new wealth by constantly finding new trade routes, and not just then with the Baltic Sea, but with the rest of the world and with Asia by going out to sea. But also with a more advanced division of labor, specializing in very small and in clever ways of coming up with the best ways of building new ships, or the most in-demand textiles, or pieces of art. Suddenly, the average Dutch household has paintings on their walls, which is unheard of until then. And in this way, sort of revolutionize almost every sector of the economy, making themselves wealthier and wealthier, so that they could more sustainably hire the troops and the ships that they need in order to combat the Spaniards. Even though originally they didn't have standing armies, and the only navy was the fishing fleet rather than anything else.
I think we need to move to my last question, and it will be about today. And I want to ask you if you think that the Western world, particularly the EU and the US, have an unhealthy relation to multiculturalism. And I want to qualify this a bit because I don't like being very, very general and abstract. I want to be a bit more specific. So I think multiculturalism is a beast of a term because we can give all sorts of meanings. We can mean all sorts of things with it. And to a degree, this applies to every term, but I think especially with multiculturalism, there's a kind of semantic volatility. In one respect, I think almost every country is multicultural, even very strong ethnostates of history, because you could say that there are people or there are kinds of people who practice different ways of living. And if we identify culture like that, we end up with multiculturalism. And on the other bit, I'm going to fast forward to very different societies, like the societies we live in, especially the 20th and 21st centuries. It seems that almost every dystopia or almost every dystopian fiction novel we have is an example of a lack of multiculturalism. Everything is just base homogeneity at everything. People are just numbers. So I'm not just, when I'm sometimes criticizing multiculturalism, I'm not criticizing that. I'm criticizing something different. Would you say that in some respects there have been governments, especially within the EU and the EU as an organization, for instance, that try to sometimes put people live together who have cultures that have vast discontinuities as far as values are concerned, which creates conflict, which then isn't policed. And then there's a whole of media apparatus and narrative that tries to present this conflict through a lens of, let's say, critical race theory or all the studies of the left, which is invoked in order to justify inaction for actually solving these problems. Would you say that this is this? You see this? And if so,
Yeah,
what's to be done about it?
Yeah, no, I can see this, and I'm glad you qualify your question. So let me qualify my response, because I think that there's one version of what some people mean to be multiculturalism that I think is the engine of any thriving society. This very fact that we're not walking around all dressed in gray with numbers, but this openness to different experiences and different backgrounds and different ways of thinking and of acting and of producing in societies. That's how we learn, and the combination of these different ingredients is how we continue to be innovative as a society. And I think that's incredibly useful, and this is one of the reasons why I think that open trade societies are much more innovative and stronger than others, because they constantly pick up new ways of enriching what they already have. However, there's another version of multiculturalism where we apply this multitude to the very sort of framework of society, the very institutions that make us thrive, and we begin suddenly to assume that no ways of living, no kinds of institutions, no societies are better than any other society, and they're all kind of equal, except possibly for the Western way of doing things, because that's the worst thing, because we constantly challenge that in every way. This is a problem, because just like we need some sort of political centralization to allow for societal decentralization, I think we need very strict and defined institutions in order to have this openness to various ways of life. And when we begin to lose that, and when we begin to second guess our own system, Western liberal democracy, too much, then I think there's a risk that everything begins to fall apart, because we need that exact framework in order to make these many colored cloaks to function in a society. So I write about this a little bit in the introduction, that there is this assumption that no society can ever, no culture can ever be better than anything else, which I think is a terrible, terrible mistake. Because as David Deutsch, the physicist, once put it, if you really think that, in that case, you're also saying that your own society can never improve, can never be better tomorrow than it is today. And in that case, obviously, religious oppression is just as good as freedom of conscience, and slavery is just as good as liberty and democracy. And in that case, we have been so self-questioning that we are risking to lose the very foundation on which we stand, and that's not a good thing. Let's not take it for granted, the kind of societies that we've built, and the relative successful societies relative to everything else that we've ever seen in world history. We need to cherish and defend those institutions, and not be so self-questioning that we question the ground on which we stand.
Mr. Norberg, thank you very much. Where can people find
Thank
your
you.
work? You're a very famous author. It's, in some respects, it's a bit weird that I'm introducing you, because I think most people know you already. But and where can people find you?
I think the best way is just to look for me on social media, and perhaps they can also look at the Cato website and find me there. This is a very Hayekian insight, that the multitude of things about me and my texts, videos, are so much larger than I can possibly centralize and understand myself. So a good search engine is usually better than asking me.
A sort of decentralized approach to things. Thank you very much.
Thank you.